At 21, Clara Reed Harcourt was dismissed with £50 and no place in the great house where she had spent most of her life. She used £20 to buy Greywood Cottage, a damp forest ruin the people of Fern Hollow considered worthless and perhaps haunted. The cottage offered no comfort, only a leaking roof, a choked pump, an overgrown garden, and work enough for years. But the worst damp came from one cellar wall, whose stones did not match the rest of the house and sounded strangely hollow. Behind that wall waited a forgotten act of safekeeping, left by someone who understood what it meant to fear losing everything. By looking beneath the decay instead of turning away, Clara would find both the means and the knowledge to build a life of her own. Clara Reed Harcourt learned the shape of the world through texture, scent, and useful work. Orphaned at 4 and taken into Blackwood Manor by her uncle, Sir Alistair Harcourt, she grew up at the edges of the household rather than at its centre. Her world was not polished mahogany or drawing-room velvet. It was the cool stone of the scullery, the sharp, clean bite of lye soap, potatoes lifted damp from the earth, and herbs hanging to dry in the attic. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, became the closest thing Clara had to a mother. She was wiry, practical, and almost impossible to deceive. Her hands were always occupied, but her attention missed very little. Mrs. Gable taught Clara how to coax lavender from tight buds, dry mint and chamomile, make comfrey poultices, judge linen, preserve damsons, and read the seasons through the garden rather than the calendar. Work to her was a language of care. Clara's only possession of true personal value was a thin silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside rested a tiny faded lock of brown hair. Clara could barely remember the woman who wore it, but the locket carried the idea of being loved before she became an obligation in someone else's household. Together, the locket and Mrs. Gable's skills formed the whole of Clara's real inheritance. When Sir Alistair died suddenly of heart trouble, the balance of Blackwood changed at once. His widow, Lady Eleanor Vale, had been married to him for only 2 years and had never considered Clara family. She saw the young woman as one more loose thread from her husband's earlier life, something to be clipped away before a new household order could begin. Clara understood the danger before anyone spoke of it. The dismissal was handled through a solicitor, which made it colder. Clara was summoned to a town office smelling of dry paper, old leather, and stale pipe smoke. Samuel Bell, an older solicitor with grey hair and a full beard, sat behind a dark desk. He was courteous but constrained by instructions. Lady Eleanor had inherited the estate in full. Clara had no legal claim. As a final settlement, Lady Eleanor offered £50 in exchange for a signed release of any future claim. £50 was enough to keep a careful woman for a time, but not enough to secure status or property in the world, Clara knew. The sum felt less like generosity than a valuation placed on her inconvenience. Still, Clara refused to plead. Mrs. Gable had taught her that dignity was a shield. She read the release, signed in a clear hand, and accepted the sovereigns. Samuel's expression suggested he disliked the arrangement, but he did not insult Clara with pity. The next morning, Clara left Blackwood Manor with 1 carpet bag, 2 changes of clothes, bread and cheese Mrs. Gable had prepared, her mother's locket, and a worn, leather-bound book of household remedies Mrs. Gable pressed into her hands at the gate. The housekeeper told her the book would serve her better than coin if she knew how to use it. Clara did not look back at the great house when she walked down the drive. A coach carried her toward the far edge of the Shire and the market town of Oak Haven. The journey stripped away the familiar order of Blackwood. Formal hedges and managed fields gave way to rougher country. Clara watched hedgerows thicken, lanes narrow, and woodland gather close to the road. Every mile made the 50 sovereigns in her purse feel both more valuable and more precarious. She bought only the cheapest food and refused a private room when a common chamber would do. Mrs. Gable's habits of economy had become instinct. At Oak Haven, Clara studied the small notices outside the property clerk's office before asking any question. There were cottages near a town, but their rents would consume her money without leaving anything permanent behind. Greywood's price was frightening precisely because it was so low. A habitable cottage on even a small plot should have cost more. That meant danger, but it also meant the possibility of ownership. Clara asked about drainage, boundaries, water, and the freehold before she asked about ghosts. The clerk looked faintly disappointed that she would not be frightened in the expected order. There she heard of a property for sale in nearby Fern Hollow. Greywood Cottage, abandoned for 40 years, and described by the clerk as scarcely more than a ruin. Clara saw a small agent's photograph showing solid stone walls and deep windows. The roof sagged, but the building still looked like something built to endure. The last part of the journey was on foot. A muddy lane wound through ancient oaks heavy with moss. Rain clung to Clara's shawl. The air smelled of wet leaves, pine resin, and dark soil. Fern Hollow appeared as a small cluster of stone cottages around a squat church tower and a public house called the Green Man. The village seemed to have grown directly from the forest. The local property office occupied a cramped room above the baker. Its clerk was dismissive until Clara made it clear she was serious. Greywood, he warned, had half a roof, a wilderness for a garden, and a reputation for being haunted. The price was £20. Clara had 50. The solid walls in the photograph mattered more to her than village gossip. She completed the purchase and received a yellow deed and a large iron key. The exchange left her £30, the remedy book, and her mother's locket. Villagers watched as she walked toward the edge of Fern Hollow. Their curiosity bordered on pity. Clara understood the look. It was the same expression respectable people gave a person who had mistaken desperation for opportunity. Greywood Cottage stood where the lane dissolved into a forest track. Ivy and brambles nearly swallowed the house. Its grey stone walls were streaked green with moss. One section of roof had collapsed, and a ground floor window was boarded. The old garden was a jungle of nettles and briars. Only the twisted branches of an apple tree rose above it. Clara did not feel despair. The neglect asked nothing of her except work. The house did not know her past, her relation to Sir Alistair or Lady Eleanor's opinion. It was damaged openly. In that honesty, Clara felt an unexpected sense of recognition. She fitted the key into the swollen oak door and pushed her way into darkness. The main room had uneven flagstones, a vast soot-black hearth, thick cobwebs, and only a rickety table with 2 damaged chairs. Clara moved slowly because rotten boards and loose plaster could make even a small room dangerous. She tested the floor with the handle of her broom before putting weight on questionable patches. Upstairs she found 2 bedrooms, one dry enough to use after the window was covered, and another beneath the broken roof. In the scullery, the pump handle moved but produced only a metallic cough. The pantry shelves were sound, and behind one door she found a row of old hooks where dried herbs had once hung. Outside, the garden told a similar story of order beneath neglect. A low stone path could still be traced through nettles. The apple tree had not been pruned in years but remained alive. Against the southern wall she found the remains of narrow beds where medicinal plants might once have grown. Those details made the cottage feel less abandoned than interrupted. Someone had known how to use this ground carefully. Clara did not yet know Beatrice Vance's name, but she was already walking through the shape of that woman's life. A narrow stair led to small bedrooms. The kitchen held a stone sink and a rusted hand pump. Everything smelled of damp, yet the oak beams were solid and the walls extraordinarily thick. Like Clara, the cottage was not finished, simply because someone else had stopped caring for it. The strongest damp came from the cellar. A trapdoor in the scullery opened onto steep stone steps. Clara descended with a candle. The small underground room smelled of wet earth and mildew. Broken barrels lay in one corner, mould furred the shelves. The far wall, set deepest into the hillside, was darker and wetter than the others. Clara noticed that its masonry was wrong. 3 walls were built from large rough blocks of local grey stone. The 4th used smaller, flatter fieldstones with poorer mortar. When she tapped it, the sound was not the solid thud of earth-backed stone, but a faint hollow echo. Mrs. Gable's lessons had trained her eye to distrust inconsistency. Clara fetched a small hammer and crowbar from the tools she had bought in Oak Haven. The mortar came away slowly. An hour of work loosened the first stone. Behind it was not soil, but dry darkness. Cool air reached Clara's face without the cellar's musty smell. She removed more stones until the false wall opened onto a small brick-lined alcove, scarcely larger than a cupboard. Inside, protected from damp, sat a tin-plated deed box and a small leather journal. Clara paused before touching either object. The alcove had been carefully built with a brick lining and a small air gap behind the false stones so moisture from the hillside could not reach the shelf. Whoever created it understood the cellar's weakness and had engineered against it. That practical intelligence made the hiding place more persuasive than any legend. The deed box carried no name. Its tin plating was dull but almost free of rust. Beside it, the journal's leather was cracked at the corners yet still supple. Clara opened the journal first and saw pages dense with botanical notes, dates, small diagrams of leaves, and measured observations about soil and weather. She could not read every faded word in the lantern light, but she understood immediately that this had belonged to someone who looked closely at ordinary things. The box was heavy enough to surprise her. Clara forced the simple lock with the crowbar. Under yellowed linen lay stacks of sovereigns and several pieces of jewelry, a pearl necklace, sapphire earrings, and a heavy gold brooch. It was a fortune, yet the journal explained why it existed. The first page belonged to Beatrice Vance, a botanist, who had lived at Greywood for 22 years and written her final entry in 1815. Her account was not dramatic. She described a nephew who had begun asking too many questions about her savings and property, a man charming in company but careless with money. Beatrice had no wish to see a lifetime of restraint converted into his debts. She therefore placed her savings where only someone willing to repair the damp cellar would discover them. That condition mattered to Clara. Beatrice had not hidden the fortune behind an obvious lock or under a loose floorboard. She had put it behind the symptom of the house's greatest problem. A person interested only in plunder might never have found it. A person trying to make Greywood healthy again eventually would. The logic felt almost like a conversation between them. "Look to the foundation of things," Beatrice had written. Clara thought Mrs. Gable would have approved. Beatrice explained that the money represented her savings, hidden from a grasping nephew who would squander them. If someone found the alcove, it would be because that person had looked past decay and examined the foundation of things. She asked the finder to use the money to build a good life within the walls she had loved. The rest of Beatrice's journal contained botanical observations, household notes, sketches, recipes for lime wash and wood polish, and careful descriptions of plants in the surrounding forest. The treasure and the knowledge belonged together. Clara recognized the same philosophy Mrs. Gable had taught her. Resources mattered only when skill gave them purpose. She did not carry the whole fortune into the village. Clara returned the deed box to the dry alcove and took only enough sovereigns to begin the work. Her first priority was the roof. In Fern Hollow she found Silas Croft, an elderly slater with hands like oak roots and the expression of a man who distrusted enthusiasm until it survived bad weather. Silas called Greywood's roof a resurrection rather than a repair. Clara placed 3 sovereigns on his workbench and asked for the job to be done properly. The sight of real gold surprised him, but her questions about materials surprised him more. He agreed to bring a young apprentice, Thomas Baird, and expected the work to take nearly 2 weeks. Soon the silence around Greywood was broken by the tap of slate hammers and boots on ladders. Silas began by stripping the failed section back to sound timber. He showed Thomas how to sort reusable slates from those cracked beyond service and explained why old stone roofs failed when hurried repairs trapped water beneath them. Clara listened while carrying debris, and soon learned to recognize the clean ring of a sound slate when tapped lightly against another. Rain interrupted the work twice. Instead of losing the day, Clara and Thomas cleared the loft and laid boards over the worst gaps so the next shower would not soak the rooms below. Silas noticed that Clara anticipated what materials would be needed before he asked. On the fourth day, he gave her the task of measuring rows from the ground while he worked above. By the end of the fortnight, the roofline no longer sagged. The house looked subtly different from the lane, not new but awake. Clara worked below, clearing rooms, scrubbing floors with lye and sand, and beginning the battle with the garden. She learned the language of roofing from listening: headlap, sidelap, battens, nails, flashing. Thomas, who had arrived expecting a foolish young woman with unexpected money, began to watch her labor with growing respect. Clara used Beatrice's journal to make lime wash. The dark interior walls became a soft, luminous white that gathered what little daylight reached the cottage. She glued and clamped the broken chair. She worked the scullery pump for hours until rust-colored water cleared and a cold stream finally rose from the well. Each repair was small. Together they changed the atmosphere of the house. Fern Hollow watched from a distance until Mrs. Hemlock, the village's formidable gossip and unofficial matriarch, appeared at the gate. She inspected the roof, Clara's muddy skirt, and the newly cleared path without offering praise. The next day she returned with bread, butter, and tomato seedlings. "No sense in a garden full of nettles," she said. The gift was practical enough to spare them both embarrassment. A neighboring farmer, Mr. Evans, later arrived with 2 sons and spent a Saturday clearing fallen branches and thick bramble. He refused money but accepted cold water from the repaired pump. The rebuilding became a conversation between Clara's labor, Beatrice's notes, and small acts of village usefulness. With the roof secure, Clara bought simple second-hand furniture and a proper iron cooking stove, the main room filled with the scent of dried herbs from the beams and bread from the stove. Her days began with the garden and ended with the remedy books. Beatrice's journal became a map to the forest's hidden resources: bilberries, plantain, yarrow, safe mushrooms, useful roots, and the places where particular herbs grew best. Clara was careful not to pretend knowledge she did not have. Mrs. Gable's book provided familiar household remedies, and Beatrice's observations gave context. When a villager asked about a child's cough, Clara prepared thyme and honey. For a minor burn, she made a calendula salve. She charged nothing. People left eggs, milk, cured meat, beeswax, or useful scraps of wood in return. Her kitchen gradually resembled a small apothecary workshop, though Clara never claimed the title. She labelled jars with simple symbols only for her own use and kept anything dangerous or uncertain separate. She refused requests that exceeded household knowledge and urged anyone seriously ill to see the village doctor. That caution increased rather than diminished trust. People understood that Clara was not selling miracles. She was sharing the practical remedies that women such as Mrs. Gable and Beatrice had recorded through long experience. The exchange around Greywood became part of Fern Hollow's rhythm. Mrs. Hemlock brought beeswax when Clara needed it for salve and went home with cuttings from the revived herb bed. Mr. Evans's wife traded milk for preserved fruit. Children were sometimes sent with baskets and returned fascinated by the forest specimens laid out to dry. Thomas built a narrow rack beneath the eaves for plants that required shade. None of this was planned as a profession. It grew from usefulness. Jars lined new shelves. Bundles of herbs dried from the rafters. Thomas Baird finished with the roof, but increasingly attached to the cottage, found reasons to pass by. He built shelves from offcuts and repaired the crumbling garden wall. Their conversation stayed rooted in work, yet a gentle affection grew inside the practical ease between them. The village's language changed. Clara was no longer the poor young woman who had wasted £20 on Greywood. She became Miss Harcourt of Greywood, the woman who knew how to restore a pump, prune an apple tree, make a useful salve and keep a cottage warm. The change in status came without a speech. It accumulated through evidence. Samuel Bell visited once after hearing from the property clerk that Clara had purchased the cottage after leaving Blackwood Manor. As the solicitor who had handled her settlement, he wanted to make sure the deed had been properly recorded. Clara showed him the document on her table while the original remained safely stored. Samuel saw the repaired roof, bright walls, orderly garden, and shelves of herbs. He told Clara, with quiet satisfaction, that Lady Eleanor had expected her £50 to disappear into lodging and necessity. Instead, Clara had converted 20 of them into land, shelter, and work. Clara did not tell Samuel about the full value of Beatrice's cash. She did not need public recognition of the fortune. The important legal matter was that Greywood belonged to her outright. The rest was a private trust between two women who had never met. By early autumn, the garden contained neat rows of kale, beans, and late vegetables. The repaired wall held the day's warmth after sunset, and the first new rows had taken along the southern side. Clara had cleared a small path to the forest edge and restored the old rain barrel under the back eaves. The cottage now supplied more of its own needs than she had thought possible when she first arrived. One evening, Samuel Bell returned with confirmation that Greywood's boundaries and title were entirely secure. Lady Eleanor had no claim on the property and could not interfere with Clara's ownership. Samuel did not ask how Clara had financed the repairs. He looked around the room, saw the evidence of disciplined work, and seemed to understand that the answer mattered less than what Clara had done with whatever means she possessed. He accepted a cup of tea and left with a packet of dried thyme. Mrs. Gable would have considered an entirely proper solicitor's fee. The old apple tree was heavy with fruit after careful pruning. Smoke from Clara's chimney hung blue in the clear evening air. On the kitchen table lay Beatrice's journal, open beside a pressed wild orchid found between its pages. Clara held her mother's silver locket and understood that she now possessed several forms of inheritance at once. Lady Eleanor had believed £50 would erase an inconvenient dependent from Blackwood's household. Instead, the money loosened the last tie binding Clara to a life lived in other people's margins. Beatrice's gold gave her capital, but the journal and Mrs. Gable's teaching gave the wealth direction. One woman had taught Clara how to work. Another, across generations, had left knowledge and means to someone willing to see past a ruined surface. Clara was not the richest woman in the Shire by land or title, nor did she want to be. Her wealth was quieter: a house free of debt, useful hands, the respect of neighbours, a garden that fed her, and the freedom to decide what tomorrow's work would be. She had been raised as a shadow in a great house. At Greywood she became visible because what she did mattered. The story villagers later told focused naturally on the false cellar wall and the hidden sovereigns. Clara understood why. Treasure made a sharper tale than limewash or repaired pumps. Yet the money alone could not have turned the ruin into a home. Without the skills Mrs. Gable taught her, Clara might have spent it quickly and remained dependent. Without Beatrice's journal, the forest would have remained scenery rather than a source of knowledge. Without the people of Fern Hollow, the cottage might have stayed private shelter rather than a place of exchange and healing. Greywood changed because labour, knowledge and community met in one neglected place. The same principle changed Clara. Lady Eleanor had measured her future in a settlement and assumed the sum represented the end of responsibility. Clara learned that value did not remain fixed at the moment someone else named it. At 21 she had been cast out with £50 and one carpet bag. She spent £20 on a forest cottage everyone else considered worthless. It was the best £20 she ever spent because the purchase gave her a foundation on which every skill she possessed could finally belong to her. The most important change was that Clara no longer measured security by how long her remaining sovereigns might last. Security had become a set of relationships and abilities, a roof she understood well enough to maintain, a pump she knew how to repair, neighbours who exchanged labour rather than condescension, and knowledge she could use without asking permission. Greywood remained modest. That was part of its strength. It required care, not ceremony, and it rewarded attention with warmth, food, and a place in the life of Fern Hollow.